Memoir of the Unseen, to by Christina Hurtgen. Front Matter. This book is dedicated to the courageous survivors of childhood trauma and demonic possession who, despite the darkness they have endured, have found the strength to heal, grow, and share their stories. Your resilience inspires me, and your experiences serve as a testament to the human spirit's indomitable strength. It is dedicated to the memory of those who lost their battles, whose suffering remains a poignant reminder of the importance of seeking help and finding hope in the darkest of times. This work is also dedicated to all those who seek answers and healing in the face of the inexplicable. May this narrative bring you a glimmer of understanding, a sense of validation, and the strength to persevere. May it serve as a beacon of hope in the ongoing battle against unseen forces, both internal and external, and a testament to the power of healing and spiritual growth. Finally, this book is dedicated to the unwavering love and support of my family and friends who have walked beside me through thick and thin, offering compassion, belief, and unwavering support. Your presence in my life is a constant reminder of the profound strength found in human connection. Writing this book has been a journey in itself, a cathartic process of confronting the darkest chapters of my life and transforming them into a narrative of hope and healing. For years, the memories remained locked away, a prison of fear and shame. But as I began to unpack my past, I realized the immense power held within those seemingly horrifying experiences. They are not just scars to be hidden, but rather, they have forged my path towards self-discovery and a profound understanding of the spiritual world. Sharing my story was not an easy decision. It involved facing deep-seated fears, confronting lingering traumas, and revisiting moments that were once unbearable. Yet, I discovered an unexpected strength in the process. Through the writing, I found a sense of control over the narratives that have haunted me, and I realized the potential for my experiences to bring solace and understanding to others who have walked a similar path. This book is a testament to the power of resilience, the enduring strength of the human spirit, and the transformative capacity of spiritual growth. Even amidst the unimaginable, it's a raw and honest account of my struggles, but it's also a story of hope and triumph, a chronicle of how darkness can ultimately give way to light. My prayer is that this story will reach those who feel lost, alone, and broken, that it will provide them with comfort, validation, and a pathway toward their own healing and spiritual awakening. 3. Chapter 1. The Shadow of Childhood. The Minneapolis winters were long and brutal, a stark contrast to the vibrant, almost feverish energy that pulsed within me, even as a child. My earliest memories are fragmented, like shattered pieces of glass reflecting distorted images of a reality I couldn't quite grasp. They're filled with shadows, not the ordinary shadows cast by the late afternoon sun in my childhood home, but something different, something that felt sentient, watchful, and malevolent. These weren't just the typical childhood and night terrors, the fleeting anxieties that plague children. These were experiences that clawed at the edges of my consciousness, leaving a residue of fear that lingered long after I awoke. One recurring image was a tall, dark figure looming at the foot of my bed. I couldn't make out details, its features were always obscured in shadow, but the feeling of its presence was overwhelmingly real. It felt cold, suffocating, its unseen weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. This entity, or whatever it was, would never fully manifest, always remaining just beyond the periphery of my vision. A constant, unsettling presence in the darkness of my room. The air would grow heavy, almost thick, with a tangible sense of dread that would leave my heart pounding long after the feeling receded. The terror wasn't limited to the nighttime. During the day, I experienced strange occurrences that I couldn't explain, even to myself. Objects would move on their own. A book falling from a shelf, a toy rolling across the floor. Initially, I chalked it up to childish imagination, a product of an overactive mind. But as these events became more frequent, more pronounced, I began to question my sanity. A small porcelain doll, a cherished gift from my grandmother, would frequently change position, its eyes seeming to follow me across the room, even when I was certain I hadn't touched it. It was as if an invisible hand were constantly rearranging my surroundings, creating a subtle but persistent sense of unease. My parents, for their part, dismissed my concerns with a mixture of indifference and thinly veiled irritation. They attributed my fears to my imagination, to the natural anxieties of childhood, or perhaps to my own mischievousness. My mother, already burdened by her own struggles with addiction, had little patience for what she perceived as my melodramatic outbursts. My father, distant and emotionally unavailable, simply offered curt dismissals, his attention always elsewhere. There was no attempt to understand, no comforting embrace, no reassurance. The events were mine to bear alone, my fears, my own personal burden. This isolation, this lack of support in a time when I most desperately needed it, further compounded my sense of fear and confusion. The unsettling occurrences weren't just frightening. They felt intensely isolating, exacerbating a pre-existing feeling of loneliness and abandonment. Our house, a modest 2-story home in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood of Minneapolis, became a locus of these strange happenings. I remember one instance vividly. I was playing in my room, a space usually filled with sunshine streaming through the large window overlooking the backyard. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness, the sun seemingly blocked by an unseen force. A chilling wave of cold swept over me, leaving my skin prickling with goosebumps despite the summer heat. The darkness wasn't merely the absence of light, it felt like a heavy, oppressive presence, a palpable entity that filled the space, silencing all sound except for the rapid thumping of my heart. When the light returned as suddenly as it had vanished, the room felt different, tainted, as if something unseen had touched it. These experiences, these subtle but persistent intrusions into the normalcy of my childhood, planted the seeds of fear that would blossom into a full-blown battle with the supernatural. There was a growing sense that I wasn't alone in my home, that unseen eyes were upon me, and that a darker, more sinister presence had taken up residence. My childhood, already scarred by the unpredictable nature of my parents' relationship and their personal struggles, was now being further haunted by something more profound, more deeply unsettling. The seemingly ordinary objects of my childhood, my toys, my books, my own bedroom, became distorted symbols of fear and vulnerability. The lack of adult comprehension only intensified my terror. The dismissive shrugs, the curt explanations, the outright lack of attention all amplified the feeling that my experiences were invalid, that my perception of reality was somehow flawed. This lack of support from the very people who were supposed to protect me created an emotional chasm, a deep-seated sense of vulnerability that left me exposed to the darkness that lurked both within and around me. It was a chilling loneliness that far surpassed the simple anxieties of a child. It was a profound isolation that amplified the sense of dread, fueling a deep-seated suspicion that perhaps I was truly alone in the battle against whatever had seized the edges of my consciousness. Beyond the physical manifestations, there was also a persistent feeling of being watched, observed. It wasn't a clear perception, not a visual sighting, but a sense of being scrutinized by something beyond human comprehension. It was a feeling of weight pressing down on me, of being under constant surveillance, a constant pressure that permeated every aspect of my life, even when the unsettling occurrences themselves were absent. It followed me from room to room, from day to night. Even in crowded places, the feeling persisted, as if an invisible cord connected me to a dark force, pulling me closer, inch by inch, into the depths of its shadowy embrace. Even the seemingly ordinary sounds of the house took on a new, sinister significance. The creaks of the floorboards, the sighs of the wind rattling the windows, the distant rumble of traffic, these once familiar noises were now distorted, infused with a subliminal layer of unease. They seemed to morph into menacing whispers, cryptic messages only I could perceive, adding another layer of chilling complexity to my experiences. Sleep, once a refuge, became an unwelcome adversary, a period of vulnerability when the entities could freely exert their influence, their unseen presence a constant threat in the darkness of my room. It's difficult to articulate the extent of the fear. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown, but the fear of something deeply wrong, something fundamentally violating the order of things. It was a primal fear, a deeply rooted sense of dread that went beyond the simplistic anxieties of a child and seeped into every aspect of my childhood. This feeling of dread, this nameless terror, would haunt me through the years, evolving and intensifying as the sinister entities within and around me continued their relentless campaign. The seeds of that unseen horror, planted in the seemingly ordinary landscapes of my Minneapolis childhood, would eventually grow into the full-blown spiritual warfare of my adult life. The whispers in the darkness, the shifting of objects, the chilling darkness, these were not simply events, but harbingers of something far more sinister, a prelude to a battle that would define the course of my life. My parents' relationship was a volatile cocktail of unspoken resentments, simmering anxieties, and explosive outbursts. The air in our home was thick with tension, a palpable energy that clung to the walls and seeped into the very fabric of our lives. My mother's struggle with addiction cast a long shadow over our family, creating an atmosphere of instability and unpredictability. The erratic shifts in her mood, the unpredictable episodes of anger and withdrawal, left me perpetually on edge, my young mind struggling to comprehend the chaotic landscape of my home. One moment she could be doting and affectionate, the next consumed by a rage that left me trembling in fear. These sudden shifts were not easily explained to a child. There was no pattern I could understand. The only constant was the ever-present fear that I, 6, did not know what to expect from her. Her addiction wasn't something that was openly discussed. It was a dark, unspoken secret that hung heavy in the air, a pervasive sense of shame that seemed to cling to the very walls of our house. The silences were deafening, punctuated by the occasional crashing of dishes or the sharp, brittle sound of her voice raised in anger. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern, a recurring cycle that shaped my understanding of love, security, and family. There was never any comfort from her. There was never a safe feeling to fall back on. I was always afraid of her next reaction. I lived in constant anticipation of the inevitable explosion. My father, in his own way, was equally distant and emotionally unavailable. He was a man of few words, his silence a thick wall that separated us. He was preoccupied with his work, often returning home late, weary and withdrawn. His presence felt almost spectral, a faint outline of a man rather than a father. He rarely engaged with me, his interactions limited to curt commands or disapproving glances. I craved his attention, but it was a craving that remained perpetually unfulfilled. He offered no protection from the storm raging around me. He did not seem to be aware there was a storm raging at all. The lack of emotional support from both parents created a profound void within me, a deep-seated sense of loneliness and abandonment. I yearned for a loving, stable environment, a refuge from the chaos, but that haven never materialized. The world felt like an unsafe place, and my home, the place that was meant to offer sanctuary, was anything but. It was a breeding ground for fear, a place where the fragile seedling of my security was constantly threatened by the storms brewing within the walls. The emotional neglect was compounded by physical abuse, mostly from my mother during her episodes of intoxication. These weren't brutal beatings, not the kind that left visible marks, but rather a series of smaller, more insidious acts of violence. A shove, a harsh slap, a sharp word delivered with venomous intent. Each act, seemingly insignificant in isolation, chipped away at my self-worth, leaving me with a deep-seated sense of vulnerability and a profound lack of self-esteem. The casual nature of the abuse was particularly damaging. It was not a rare occurrence. It was a part of everyday life. These episodes of physical abuse were invariably followed by periods of intense guilt and self-blame. I would spend hours replaying the events in my mind, trying to understand what I had done to provoke her anger. The lack of any rational explanation only heightened my feeling of worthlessness, reinforcing the belief that I, 7, was somehow fundamentally flawed, unworthy of love and affection. The episodes weren't just physical, the damage was emotional, and it was far-reaching. It created a deep and lasting wound, a wound that opened me to the dark spirits that would begin to haunt me. The combination of emotional neglect and physical abuse created a fertile ground for the paranormal experiences I began to endure. The feeling of being watched, the unsettling occurrences in the house, the chilling presence in the darkness, all of these seemed to be amplified by my already fragile emotional state. The vulnerability I felt within my family dynamic created a void, a gaping hole in my soul that seemed to beckon to unseen entities. I was ripe for exploitation. The darkness found me because I was already broken. My childhood home wasn't merely a place of residence. It was a battleground, a space where the turmoil of my family life intersected with the unseen forces of the supernatural. The disharmony within my family, the emotional and physical abuse, created a fractured reality, a space where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds became blurred. The trauma I experienced was not simply a series of isolated events. It was a tapestry woven from threads of neglect, abuse, and a pervasive sense of fear and isolation that created an emotional and spiritual vulnerability that made me an easy target. The memories are fragmented, but certain images remain etched in my mind. The harsh glare in my mother's eyes during her rages, the heavy silence following my father's curt dismissals, the chilling darkness that often descended upon our home. These were not mere events. They were building blocks, components of a childhood where the lines between physical and spiritual reality blurred. The supernatural experiences were not isolated. They were deeply interwoven with the fabric of my daily life, a nightmarish reflection of the dysfunctional family dynamic. The isolation was perhaps the most damaging aspect of my childhood. I had no one to confide in, no one to offer comfort or support. My fears and anxieties were my own private burden, a secret that I carried silently, weighing down my young shoulders. The lack of adult understanding compounded the feeling of isolation, amplifying their sense of dread and exacerbating my emotional vulnerability. I felt utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare from which there seemed no escape. My home, the place where I should have felt safe and protected, had become a prison, a space of unrelenting emotional and spiritual torment. The unseen entities that invaded my childhood seemed to feed on my vulnerability, thriving in the emotional vacuum created by my family's dysfunction. The absence of protection and understanding created a profound sense of vulnerability that extended far beyond the walls of my family home. It became a pervasive feeling that accompanied me into adulthood, coloring my perceptions and influencing my relationships. The experiences of childhood created a rift within me, a sense of fractured identity that I spent years trying to repair. The traumas were not simply events of the past. They were embedded in my very being, shaping my worldview and influencing my interactions with others. The darkness in my childhood was not just the darkness of the supernatural, but the darkness of my own shattered sense of self. The recovery process from the trauma of my childhood was difficult, but I was only able to begin to heal when I confronted the damage that had been done, both physically and spiritually. The healing process was slow, but it was only possible when I accepted that I was not alone. The unsettling feelings began subtly, almost imperceptible shifts in the atmosphere of my life. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic event, but rather a gradual crescendo of unease, a slow tightening of dread that wound its way into the fabric of my daily existence. It started with a sense of being watched, a persistent feeling that I was never truly alone, even in the most isolated places. This feeling was particularly pronounced in my childhood home in Minneapolis, a place already steeped in the shadows of family dysfunction. There, in the echoing silence of my bedroom, or in the dimly lit hallways, I would feel a cold breath on the back of my neck, a fleeting touch that sent shivers down my spine, even on the hottest summer nights. These sensations were initially dismissed as mere anxieties, the byproducts of a troubled childhood. However, the incidents became more frequent, more insistent. Objects would move inexplicably, a book falling from a shelf, a lamp swaying gently despite the stillness of the air. Whispers seemed to emanate from the darkness, barely audible, yet chillingly present. Words and phrases that felt both personal and menacing. They were not just sounds, but sensations, tingling in my ears, pressing against my mind, a form of auditory intrusion that disturbed my sense of peace. One evening, while sitting alone in my room, I felt a cold, heavy weight settle upon me, an oppressive force that pinned me to my chair. The air grew thick, charged with an energy that was both terrifying and strangely alluring. I felt a presence, close, tangible, a malevolent entity that seemed to press against my very soul. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in, as if the unseen presence sought to suffocate me, to consume me. This feeling of being trapped, of being invaded, was excruciating. It felt gnawing, as if something was trying to occupy my space and my thoughts. The intense pressure was accompanied by a surge of nausea and dizziness, a physical manifestation of the spiritual assault. My heart pounded in my chest, and I struggled to breathe, caught in the grip of unseen forces. The feeling wasn't merely fear, it was a profound sense of violation, a spiritual invasion, that left me feeling exposed and vulnerable. I remember feeling a cold dread, an icy grip that seized my mind. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, swirling with unseen energy. The darkness felt alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy, as if it held a conscious intent, a sinister purpose. I was alone in the physical world, but there were other presences around me. These encounters were not isolated occurrences. They became a recurring pattern, a nightly ritual of fear and intrusion. I would often wake in the middle of the night to find myself bathed in a cold sweat, my body trembling, my heart racing. Sometimes I would see shadowy figures flitting at the edge of my vision, fleeting glimpses of something malevolent and terrifying. Other times I would hear whispers, disembodied voices that seemed to crawl into my ears, tainting my thoughts with doubt, fear, and despair. However, amidst the terror, there were moments of clarity, moments where the darkness seemed to momentarily lift, revealing glimpses of something else, something beyond the malevolence. It was through these moments of clarity that I began to discern the existence of a different entity, a presence that felt different, somehow protective. This being, which I would later come to understand as my spirit guide, first revealed itself to me as a voice, a gentle whisper in the midst of the chaotic voices that filled my mind. It wasn't a human voice, but somehow I understood its meaning. I understood its language. This guide began to communicate with me telepathically, sharing information about the spiritual world, information beyond the grasp of ordinary human comprehension. It described the hierarchy of spiritual entities, the intricate workings of the astral plane, knowledge that seemed to come from another realm. I began to understand the dynamics of the demonic realm, the strategies employed by negative entities to infiltrate and manipulate human lives. I learned how they fed on negative emotions. Fear, anger, hate, and despair empowered the darkness. The knowledge was both terrifying and fascinating, a glimpse into a world both unseen and terrifyingly real. I learned about the techniques these entities used to manipulate people, the ways they preyed upon vulnerabilities, the paths they used to tend, infiltrate, and manipulate the minds of their victims. I started to see how my own childhood trauma had created a vulnerability within me, and how this vulnerability made me susceptible to these negative forces. The negative energy I absorbed from my dysfunctional family life became food for these dark spirits. The trauma allowed me to be open to their influence, to be open to their presence. The encounters became more complex. A kind of spiritual warfare played out within the confines of my own mind. The malevolent entity and the protective spirit clashed. Their battles waged within my consciousness. I felt like a battlefield, the site of a titanic struggle between light and darkness. I would feel incredible physical sensations as this battle raged within me. My body would contort involuntarily, as if wrestling with some unseen force. I would feel immense pain, as if some invisible entity was tearing at my flesh. Sometimes I would be overcome with waves of nausea and dizziness, feeling like I would black out. Sometimes I would feel a surge of energy through my body, feeling almost euphoric. These incidents were not only terrifying, but also incredibly disorienting. The line between reality and illusion blurred, the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds dissolving. I had to learn to differentiate. I had to learn to protect myself. I was thrust into a world beyond my comprehension, where the unseen battles raged and the darkness was real. I began to understand that the demonic possession was not random. It was a deliberate targeting of my vulnerable state. The darkness found a way into my life because of the darkness within my own family. It was during these early encounters that I started to understand the true nature of my spirit guide, its purpose in my life. This being, which I initially perceived as a protective force, eventually revealed itself to me as a multifaceted entity. It was both my spirit guide and a Holy Spirit, a being of incredible power and knowledge. This understanding fundamentally shifted my perspective, providing a context for the chaotic experiences that I was enduring. I began to see my life in a different light. I saw my trauma in a new way, realizing that it was a catalyst that pushed me into this incredible and terrifying journey. The encounters continued, escalating in intensity and frequency. My life became a maelstrom of spiritual chaos, a continuous battle between good and evil, where the physical and metaphysical worlds collided. It wasn't something that I could easily explain to others. No one would believe me. I was utterly alone. My childhood home in Minneapolis became the epicenter of this spiritual warfare, a place where the veil between worlds thinned allowing the unseen to manifest itself in 11, increasingly disturbing ways. Specific locations within the house became particularly charged, resonating with malevolent energy. My bedroom became a site of constant psychic activity. The basement, already dark and damp, seemed to pulsate with a sinister energy, a palpable darkness that pressed upon me with a suffocating weight. The attic, with its dust-laden furniture and cobweb-draped corners, became a site of frightening visions. These were places where I could feel the strongest presence of the negative energy. These weren't just places in my house, they became nodes of intense spiritual conflict. It was where the battles between good and evil were fought. It was where I wrestled with my spiritual demons. The experiences were deeply visceral, profoundly impacting not only my emotional state, but also my physical well-being. The constant psychic assault left me exhausted, drained, and frequently ill. My body was a vessel for these battles. The toll on my physical and mental health was immense. The constant fear, the relentless psychic attacks, the emotional and spiritual turmoil, they took their toll. The journey was long and arduous, filled with fear, doubt, and intense spiritual conflict. But it was also a journey of discovery, a gradual unveiling of hidden truths, a confrontation with the unseen forces that shape our lives, the unraveling of my childhood trauma intertwined with my spiritual experiences, each amplifying the other. It was a chaotic symphony of fear, pain, and enlightenment. But I wasn't alone in my struggle. I had a spirit guide, a Holy Spirit, to guide me through the darkness. The darkness that had haunted me since childhood was finally beginning to give way to the light. My attempts to explain what was happening were met with disbelief, confusion, and at times outright dismissal. To my family, my experiences were simply symptoms of an overactive imagination, a product of my already troubled childhood. My parents, burdened by their own issues, were ill-equipped to understand, much less address, the spiritual warfare raging within me. Their reactions ranged from dismissive to concerned, but ultimately, their support was limited by their own understanding. They were afraid, and their fear manifested in a kind of helpless avoidance. The discussions invariably ended with suggestions of therapy or medication, solutions that addressed the symptoms, but not the underlying cause. I sought help from friends, sharing snippets of my experiences, always carefully choosing my words, diluting the truth to avoid being deemed insane. Their reactions were largely similar to my family's, a mixture of concern, skepticism, and a desperate desire to offer comfort without understanding the depth of my suffering. They, 12, suggested therapists, self-help books, and various relaxation techniques, all attempts to manage the symptoms, not the root cause of my torment. The subtle shift in their demeanor, the gradual distancing, was a silent testament to the strangeness of what I was describing. Their discomfort mirrored the societal stigma surrounding such experiences, a tacit acknowledgement of the uncharted territories I was exploring. Their inability to help, coupled with my own growing fear, only intensified my isolation. Medical professionals offered little solace. Doctors attributed my symptoms to anxiety, depression, and sleep deprivation, prescribing medication that did little to alleviate the psychic assaults and spiritual battles that plagued me. The treatments addressed the surface-level manifestations of the possession, but failed to touch the core issue, the malevolent entity that was actively trying to consume me. Each visit ended with a feeling of profound inadequacy, a reinforcement of my growing sense of helplessness. I felt like I was trapped in a medical purgatory, caught between a world that couldn't understand my plight and the growing darkness within me. The medical model simply wasn't equipped to grapple with what I was experiencing. It was like trying to treat a gunshot wound with aspirin. The increasing isolation fueled the entity's power. The more alone I felt, the more vulnerable I became. It was as if my isolation was a feast for the demonic entity, feeding its malevolence and strengthening its hold on me. The entity seemed to thrive on my growing despair, its influence subtly intensifying with each failed attempt to seek help. It was as if it sensed my vulnerability, feeding off my fear and uncertainty. The whispers intensified, becoming clearer, more menacing, more personal. I delved into my deepest insecurities, my darkest fears, exploiting my vulnerabilities with cruel precision. The assaults became more frequent, more intense, and far more insidious. The entity would manipulate my thoughts, whispering suggestions of self-harm and suicide, attempting to push me to the brink of despair. It would twist my memories, casting doubt on my sanity, ensuring that I was not only physically and emotionally exhausted, but also mentally tormented. The line between reality and illusion continued to blur, making it increasingly difficult to discern truth from the insidious manipulations of the entity. I struggled to maintain my grip on reality, fighting the relentless tide of doubt and despair that it unleashed. My physical health deteriorated rapidly. The constant psychic warfare drained my energy, leaving me perpetually exhausted, often feverish and ill. Sleep became a 13 battlefield in itself, a nightmarish landscape of psychic attacks and relentless terrors. Even during moments of rest, I wasn't truly at peace, the entity's influence lingering at the periphery of my consciousness. The physical manifestations of the possession became more pronounced. Involuntary muscle spasms, debilitating headaches, and a constant feeling of nausea. My body was literally bearing the brunt of the spiritual war raging within me. My weakened state only emboldened the entity, its power growing with each passing day. The feeling of being trapped was overwhelming. I was trapped in a prison of my own mind, haunted by an unseen enemy that fed on my pain and despair. I was trapped in a world that couldn't understand my suffering, a world that dismissed my experiences as symptoms of mental illness. I was trapped in a cycle of helplessness and despair, the demonic entity's power increasing with every failed attempt to seek help. This sense of isolation, this feeling of being alone in the face of such overwhelming evil, was almost as debilitating as the possession itself. In retrospect, the inadequacy of conventional support systems was a crucial factor in the escalation of my torment. The inability to find someone who truly understood, who could offer effective help beyond medication and therapy, left me feeling utterly alone and vulnerable. This vulnerability, this profound sense of isolation, became a breeding ground for the demonic entity's growth. It was a crucial factor that shaped the trajectory of my experience, driving the conflict into a darker, more intense phase. The experiences continued to erode my sense of self, threatening to consume my identity completely. The relentless psychic attacks, the manipulation of my thoughts and emotions chipped away at my sense of self-worth, confidence, and stability. I was being deconstructed by this unseen entity, piece by piece, day by day. It was a slow, agonizing process that left me feeling lost, confused, and deeply afraid. I recall one particularly terrifying incident. I was alone in my childhood home, the familiar, oppressive darkness settling over me. The air grew heavy, suffocating, and the whispering began, a cacophony of voices swirling around me, each a cruel reminder of my helplessness. The entity's presence felt palpable, a crushing weight that pressed down on me, threatening to extinguish the last embers of my hope. I could feel the entity's energy pulsating through me, a malevolent force that seemed determined to shatter my spirit. This night became a watershed moment, marking a turning point in my struggle. 14. It was during these moments of overwhelming fear and despair that I began to seriously consider taking my own life. The insidious suggestions from the entity became almost unbearable. It whispered promises of peace, of an end to the relentless torment. Suicide seemed like the only escape from the constant torment. The thoughts were terrifying, yet strangely alluring, offering a brief respite from the unrelenting pain. It was a battle that unfolded within my mind, the entity fighting to claim my soul, to finally extinguish the light within me. It was in those desperate moments that I realized I needed something more, something beyond conventional help. I needed a different approach, a different understanding of what I was experiencing. My survival depended on it. The assaults became a relentless barrage. No longer were they subtle whispers. They were screaming voices, a cacophony of malice that echoed within my skull, twisting my thoughts into grotesque parodies of my own intentions. I would start a sentence, intending to write a simple grocery list, only to find the words contorted into blasphemous pronouncements, my hand scrawling obscenities across the page as if possessed by an alien intelligence. The entity reveled in this power, mocking my attempts to regain control, delighting in my growing helplessness. It was a cruel game of psychological torture, designed to break me, to reduce me to a quivering wreck. Sleep offered no respite. My nights were consumed by vivid, terrifying nightmares, each more visceral and disturbing than the last. I would find myself trapped in suffocating darkness, pursued by shadowy figures that whispered threats and promises of unimaginable horrors. The dreams felt intensely real, leaving me exhausted and emotionally drained even before I woke. Upon waking, the lingering effects of these night terrors manifested as a pervasive sense of dread, a deep-seated unease that clung to me throughout the day. The world felt subtly wrong, warped, as if viewed through a distorted lens. My physical health continued its precipitous decline. The constant psychic attacks manifested in debilitating headaches, so intense they felt as if my skull would crack open. My body was racked with involuntary muscle spasms, making even simple tasks like walking or eating agonizing ordeals. I experienced bouts of fever, my temperature soaring to dangerous levels, further weakening my already fragile constitution. My appetite waned, replaced by a constant feeling of nausea and dread. The relentless exhaustion left me perpetually drained, unable to focus, to think clearly, to function normally. I became a shadow of my former self, a frail reflection of the person I once was. 15. The isolation intensified my suffering. Friends and family, already hesitant due to my increasingly erratic behavior and bizarre pronouncements, began to distance themselves, their concern shifting to alarm and eventually, fear. Their inability to understand, coupled with the social stigma surrounding my experiences, created a chilling vacuum of support. I felt like I was falling into an abyss, utterly alone and hopelessly adrift in a sea of darkness. My attempts to explain my situation only served to reinforce their apprehension. My words, however carefully chosen, sounded increasingly deranged, fueling their fear and prompting their retreat. The entity fed on my isolation, its power growing in direct proportion to my growing sense of helplessness. It reveled in my despair, twisting my most cherished memories, casting doubt on my sanity, and relentlessly whispering suggestions of self-harm and suicide. The whispers became personal, laced with intimate knowledge of my deepest insecurities, my greatest fears, my most vulnerable moment. It used this intimate understanding of my psyche to torment me with terrifying precision, each attack meticulously calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage. It was as if it had become a perverse extension of my own darkest thoughts, a manifestation of my deepest self-doubt and despair. My days were a blur of pain and confusion. My nights a relentless cycle of horrifying nightmares. I was living a life divided, a constant battle between the fragile remnants of my rational self and the overwhelming power of the malevolent entity that was slowly consuming me. The line between reality and illusion blurred, the entity seamlessly weaving its influence into my perceptions, making it increasingly difficult to distinguish between my own thoughts and its insidious manipulations. I started doubting my own sanity, questioning the reality of my experiences, wondering if I had finally succumbed to madness. The escalating intensity of the possession pushed me to the brink of desperation. The physical pain was almost unbearable, but the psychological torment was far more devastating. My sense of self was rapidly eroding, my identity fracturing under the relentless onslaught of psychic attacks. I felt like a puppet, my body and mind manipulated by an unseen puppeteer, my will powerless against its relentless control. Hope dwindled to a faint ember, barely flickering in the face of the overwhelming darkness. I tried various coping mechanisms. I tried meditation, hoping to find some inner peace, some respite from the ceaseless torment, but the entity's influence permeated even these moments of attempted serenity, twisting the meditation into a 16-nightmarish experience, transforming calming mantras into blasphemous incantations. I tried journaling, attempting to record my experiences in the hope that externalizing them would somehow diminish their power, but the entity seemed to infect even my writing, distorting the words on the page, mocking my attempts at self-expression. My attempts to seek conventional help continued to fail. Therapists, while sympathetic, remained baffled by my experiences. Their tools were inadequate, their approaches mismatched to the nature of my affliction. Medication offered no relief, instead adding to the already overwhelming cloud of confusion and disorientation. Each attempt to find solace, each avenue explored, resulted in another layer of despair, another brick in the wall of my growing isolation. One particularly harrowing incident stands out. I awoke in the middle of the night, my body paralyzed with fear. The room was plunged into an unnatural darkness, far denser and heavier than the normal night. The air crackled with a malevolent energy, and a chilling whisper slithered into my consciousness, promising untold suffering and eternal damnation. The entity's presence was tangible, a suffocating weight pressing down upon me, threatening to crush the life from my body. The voice seemed to emanate from within me, yet also from everywhere at once, an omnipresent, insidious presence that permeated the very fabric of my being. Terror threatened to overwhelm me. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I struggled to move, to scream, to fight back against this suffocating, malevolent presence. I'll continue it as a fictional supernatural memoir-style narrative, adding several chapters before the final resolution, so the ending has a stronger build-up. Chapter 17, The Last Flicker of Hope. The experience felt endless. I lay there trapped between fear and exhaustion, unable to tell where my own thoughts ended and the darkness began. Every instinct inside me screamed to fight, but I felt powerless. The presence that had haunted me for so long seemed determined to convince me that I was alone, forgotten, and beyond saving. But somewhere beneath the terror, beneath the confusion, something remained. A tiny voice, a memory, a whisper of hope. I remembered the prayers I had spoken when I was younger. I remembered moments when I felt peace, moments when I believed there was something greater than the darkness surrounding me. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I reached for that memory. Not because I felt strong, because I had nothing left. With tears running down my face, I whispered, "God, if you are there, help me." The room remained silent. The darkness remained. But something inside me shifted. The fear did not disappear instantly, but a small spark of courage began to burn. I realized the entity had spent so much time convincing me that I had no power, that I was nothing but a victim. But maybe that was the lie. Maybe the battle was not over. Chapter 18, The Battle Within. The days that followed became a turning point. The darkness fought harder. The nightmares intensified. The whispers returned. The attack seemed more desperate, as if whatever force had tormented me knew it was losing its grip. But I started changing. I stopped running from the fear. I began facing it. I searched deeper into my faith, into prayer, into understanding who I was beyond the pain. I started writing again, not to document my suffering, but to reclaim my voice. Every word became an act of defiance. Every prayer became a reminder. I was not only the person who suffered, I was the person who survived. The entity had studied my weaknesses, but it underestimated one thing: my desire to find the truth. Chapter 19, The Light Breaks Through. One night, after another exhausting battle, I woke up expecting the same darkness, the same heaviness, the same presence. But something was different. The room felt calm, the air felt lighter. For the first time in years, silence did not feel threatening. It felt peaceful. I sat there, waiting for the fear to return. But it didn't. I prayed, I cried. I thanked God for giving me another moment of clarity. I realized healing was not a single dramatic moment. It was a journey. A process of rebuilding what had been broken. The chains that had wrapped around my mind and spirit were beginning to loosen. Chapter 20, Reclaiming My Life. Recovery was not easy. There were still questions, still memories, still scars from the battle, but I was no longer controlled by fear. I began helping others who felt trapped in their own darkness. I listened to people who felt invisible, people who felt like they had lost themselves. And I understood them. Because I had been there. I knew what it felt like to believe there was no way out. I knew what it felt like to search for hope in the middle of despair. And now I could tell them. Darkness may be loud, but hope can be stronger. Chapter 21, The Final Confrontation. The final battle was not what I expected. I thought victory would come with thunder, signs, and a moment where everything changed instantly. Instead, it came quietly. It came when I chose faith over fear, when I chose forgiveness over bitterness, when I chose life over the lies that had tried to destroy me. The voice that once seemed unstoppable became distant. The darkness that once filled every corner began to fade, and I finally understood. The greatest battle was never only against what haunted me. It was the battle to believe I was still worthy of being saved. Chapter 22. Freedom. Years later, I would look back and barely recognize the person I had been. The woman who once felt trapped. The woman who questioned her own existence. The woman who believed the darkness had won. She was still me, but she was also proof that broken things can be restored. My story was not about being defeated. It was about being transformed. The chains that once held me became the testimony I carried. And the darkness that tried to silence me became the reason I learned to speak. I walked away from that battle changed. Not because I never faced darkness again, but because I finally knew where my strength came from. And that was the beginning of my freedom. The End 2026. Christina Hurtgen.